everyone. How you doing? I'm having problems with some of my visual effects here going on. I'm not getting the appropriate video when I'm going live, which is kind of frustrating and weird because I had made a whole point of creating a the lava lamp effect behind us, and I'm not quite sure where it went, and that makes me very sad. Let me try doing something once. See if I can change that. It worked in the test, which I don't understand why it's not working when I go live. I find it very, very weird. Maybe if I loop it and try it that way. Oh, that might be it. Okay, hold on one quick second. There we go. I didn't have it on loop, and therefore when I got to the end of the video, it just quit. So that was the problem. Hey everyone, how you doing? Hope you're having a wonderful day. I am, hope you're excited here for your research design using case studies or OBS video advice video, whatever it is you're coming here to watch. Oh, that's what we got going on today. Anyway, I am Kristi, and today it is Social Science Sunday. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever it is, whatever it is you are. I know that we get people from all over the world watching this, which is super exciting. So hello, who would say hi, DN fan, and Easy7, Sibby, Faye Queen Corey, good morning and good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Got a new flavor of White Claw to try, sounds awesome. I'm just eating almond nuts as a light snack. Hey, Sean. All right, well, I also have more exciting news in that I watched back, I couldn't remember what I covered in the last video because it feels like a lot's happened since last week, and I noticed my audio was garbage. So I went and checked my settings, and yeah, sure enough, this new expensive mic that I invested in to get really high quality audio wasn't even turned on. I hope that this is a much more pleasant experience for you to listen to now. All right, so let's get going on the question. Let's connect some of the dots because it has been a week. I went back and listened to the crappy audio on the last episode. One of the things that we generally discussed was research design. How is it that we can go out and qualitatively collect appropriate data in order to evaluate it for concepts, categories, and relations between phenomenon that we can use to help us build a theory? Because remember, a qualitative approach's strengths are inductive. And sometimes, you get like the thing you think exists, it might be spurious. You might think X causes Y, but it's really Z causing Y. And you want to get into the data. We talked about pilot studies so that you don't commit all your resources to data collection before you know whether or not you're heading in the right direction. Also, the flexibility of qualitative research, that if you start with one question, but as over the course of your research, you find a far more interesting question or a new thing that hasn't been looked at or whatever else that makes you wish you could change your research design and focus on that new thing, you can do that. Whereas in quantitative, because of its nature of everyone having to receive the exact same stimuli in order to produce what we hope is an equal response, a similar response, whatever how they interpret it, but the stimuli is the same, so the response should be comparable. Once you're committed for life. That's it. You're not getting a second chance to go back and collect 400 cases from, even an internet quota sampling anymore. It's expensive to do, so you've got to be right up front. All right, so let's talk about one of the ways that you could do qualitative research. There are many different approaches to doing inductive data collection, the basis for your data, your inductive reasoning. Wording is hard today. And today what I want to focus on is a very common one that is used. Case studies are not only used in the quantitative or the qualitative sciences, we also have little case studies in the quants as well. So let me get to the right screen. I've been hard at work. Oh, okay, I see what I have to do. All right, hold on a second. 1, 2, 3. Excellent. All right. Boom. People said in the show yesterday they liked Lava Lamp. I brought back Lava Lamp. So I'm futzing still. I redesigned the setup. I reconnected the whatchamacallit, audio. I'm trying to multitask. I'm trying to stream and rearrange images and whatnot all in one good go, and it gets a little bit hairy. So let me I'm going to tweak a little bit. Tweak, rock and robin. All right. There we go. I think that's a little bit more balanced. So yeah, now you got lava lamp. Look at that. Lava lamp for your Sunday morning. Qualitative research and lava lamp. What could be better? And now the video is on loop, so it will go endlessly. All right. Oh, by the way, if you missed it, yesterday I had a fantastic conversation with Dana Cole here on the channel. We had a conversation about patriarchy and the way that it moves. My case would be it moves quite invisibly through our culture because it is so assumed. And really the trans discussion or the trans rights discussion in a similar way that starting in the 70s and moving through the 80s and 90s, we needed to break apart the homophobia inherent in patriarchy. And we have, I think, made some really serious progress, some significant progress in destroying that underpinning pillar of patriarchy. The next one too is another element of that patriarchy is really imposing a sex hierarchy. One in which your value as a human being, your worth as a human being, your credibility as a human being is dependent on your genitals. And they have to be specific genitals and you have to be cis, right? And your body has to look even a certain way in order for you to be seen as, this credible person. And the epitome of credibility in America and a lot of Europe is a white man. And that and some people get a lot of security from feeling like they have a natural superiority over everyone else. And attacking that challenges them. It makes them feel like, oh, wait a minute, I can't just say the man says no and win an argument. I mean, imagine what that would be like if you just having an argument with anyone, who identifies differently as a gender and just say the whatever you are says no, and then that ends the debate. I mean, that would be awesome, but it's unfair and wrong and bad. Oh, anyway, go have a look at that conversation. We had a lot of fun. Hopefully Dana and I can find another topic to nerd out on. And I will have lava lamp throughout the talk, and I will look straight into the camera because my eyes were, I think, everywhere in that conversation. Anyway, let's get going on with some research methods, because that's what you're here to hear about. Oh, yeah, to put one of those in the timestamps, starts at 7 minutes and 3 seconds or whatever. We're going to look at case studies. And before we can talk about how to use case studies, we should talk about what case studies are and why they're particularly useful in qualitative research. Case studies are anytime actually you want to go in depth. You can do probably a quantitative case. Well, you get case studies more in international relations, for instance, because there aren't enough cases. There are barely enough cases. We have 207 countries in the world, right? So it's very difficult to generalize in international relations work. Oftentimes what you'll get is a case study that compares a set of countries, and it's quite quantitative in nature, but it's not meant to be super generalizable because it only applies to the country. So, right. It's a qualitative, so case studies are generally a qualitative descriptive research format. The idea is that you want to look deeply at individuals or a small participant pool. Let's see oh, by the way, Easy7, wanted to see my perspectives on the origins of patriarchy, and I thought you had a good insight. Thank you. I feel like if I had enough time in the world, I would want to write a book on my take on patriarchy, because I don't think there are any good books on patriarchy at the moment. But not that saying that the ones that aren't out there aren't good. I'm just saying they don't talk about the things I want to read about. Talk about the things I'm interested in. Case studies the focus is to really understand deeply one element of usually a larger process or problem or system or structure. It includes the lived experiences of the people who are in that culture or setting or group. And I put lived experiences in the title of this directly to contrast with King Crocoduck, who has put out some other piece of crap video attacking an academic concept where, he can hide in his YouTube bubble and doesn't have to deal with legitimate real world criticisms. So I'm going to just underpin the value of lived experiences as being necessary to understand our social reality. Whether or not you find someone's experience of their social reality credible is kind of irrelevant, right? Because Trump MAGA people to me are delusional. But it doesn't matter to me that I don't agree with their worldview. They act upon it, and therefore they affect my social reality. So whether or not I agree with them, I have to accept the validity of the premise that someone's lived experiences will shape their actions, beliefs, and opinions. And to try to attack that premise is just ridiculous. So anyway, so with lived experiences, you're going to learn about people's perspectives, like what a janitor experiences at their job or her job or their whatever is going to be different from an office worker. It's going to be different from a middle manager. It's going to be different from human resources staff, right, if we're looking at a business. But each one of them have a valid perspective in terms of their experience working at that company, let's say. So the conclusions that you draw from a case study, because it's a limited pool, it's very deep and focused, right? It can only really be, it's describing that context or describing that dynamic. But that's not to say that that dynamic exists independent of every other situation. Let's take an example. You want to do an analysis of the culture of a political campaign. Everything for me is political science. I'm a political scientist, so everything I do is in reference of political science. Let's say I'm interested in like the culture, power structures, the way that information flows or doesn't flow in a political campaign. So I go and I get permission to join the local Democratic Party's field office as a volunteer, understanding that my job is to participate, but also to talk to people and to be able to observe the workings and what's going on. I might have some confidentiality thing, like I can't talk about things that happened in the campaign while the campaign's going on. I might have some agreement with the participants that before anything gets published, I will run it by them in case they want to remove anything for sensitive, for reasons, personal, not personal identifying, I would clear that out, but let's say campaign strategies or something, whatever else, right? So I get that permission, I go embed myself. And I look at who comes in, who goes out, what time they come in, what the power structure is, how people talk about the campaign, how people talk about other people on the staff, the challenges they might be facing with the state party, the challenges they might be facing with the DCCC or whatever national thing. So, I'm getting a whole sense of this little community. Now, is it the case that I can just say, now I know how Democratic Party offices work across the country? No. But do I have a hint that maybe other offices have this approach toward dealing with the state party, or have this approach with dealing with the national campaign, or have this power structure, or have these dynamics? Well, I have a good grounding for now going in and looking for things. So when you draw conclusions, you can also then, your conclusions are like only this and nothing else. It could be definitely this, and let's look to see if there's something else. It's way more tentative because it's inductive. You're doing theory generation. You have to think. When you do deductive, so let me just point this out, right? For the science people like King Crocoduck who don't like these inductive methods that, look to describe social reality from the experience of the people in the social reality, doing, interacting with it or having it forced on them in some cases, is that when you do a deductive theoretical approach, you come up with your null hypothesis and your alternative hypothesis. But someone's done all the thinking for you, right? Like, whoever it is, whether it's, political party identification or economic valuations or whatever else, you basically read other people's words and you decide what you think is credible, decide what you think is convincing, whatever it is, like cross-reference things to see if it's been tested or whatever. But you're not being original when you're going to test somebody else's ideas. And then you come along, you get your alternative and null hypothesis, you run your tests and you draw your conclusions. Maybe you find something new and then you have to think for the first time, right? So the deductive approach rides on the coattails of other people's intellectual efforts. Qualitative because it is inductive, because it is exploratory, because it is oftentimes under-theoretically developed, right? Qualitative research is used by marginalized communities because there's no data on these communities. No one's bothered to think about them or categorize them as someone who should be like, we should ask that question, do you belong to this group or do you have this, belief system? And then we can't so that's why we do qualitative stuff. So the conclusions you can draw conclusions about the group, and then you can wonder, like, where else might these relations between categories or concepts or groups exist? And the emphasis in a case study is really on the exploration and getting a good handle on the dynamics, the description of the context that things are happening in. Next. What's going on? All right, here we go. Yes. All right. So as I'm saying, when you do a case study, you're not trying to find a universal generalizable truth. You're looking for the seeds of cause and effect relations. And I like, because we're working currently on this, my co-author and I are working on a paper on replicating qualitative research. Can you replicate qualitative research? The argument that we're getting to is that while it's the case in quantitative research that you sample from a population in order to make generalizations about the sample, about the people, in qualitative research, you sample a population to establish the existence of categories, concepts. These guys said explanations. I'm not going to say explanations. I'm going to say relationships between categories, concepts, and people. And then try to see if the concepts are generalizable. You're looking to establish the existence of a concept. Like maybe one of the things you can do is think about it. You're looking to establish or understand better or ground or get some nuance on a concept or a category or some kind of relational dynamic that has yet to be substantiated or well understood, or people took the time to really look into it. Like, there's a lot of things to research in the world. We can't get to everything. So you're going to go and dive into this. You're going to do your exploratory work. You're going to collect data here, here, here. And you're not going to say, this person said this person said this person said this, as much as you're going to say, I hear this concept emerging from my discussions. I hear this category emerging from my discussions. And that is what the analytic generalization part of qual is for, is to analyze, can you generalize concepts to other groups? So it might not work the same, but it exists somewhere else. So that is the big argument that we're going to be making in this replication paper. I think now we've been working on it for a while and kind of just we've been too quantsy in our approach, and we needed to really embrace the epistemological validity of qualitative research in terms of its transferability and transparency, so it has credibility and whatnot. Okay. What are the good things about qualitative or case studies? Well, as I mentioned before, they're super flexible. You're exploring. You're not trying to predict. You're not like, can I be proven wrong? Because you're generally in an underexplored area or an area that is taking ideas from somewhere else and applying it to a new context. So this means that you're more freed as a researcher to go down a line of inquiry. As I was saying before, if you find a new idea or a more interesting idea or something emerges that you hadn't seen before, you have the flexibility in a qualitative research program to change midway through the stream and go back and say top up some interviews with a couple other people and then carry a new question forward. Generally, case studies begin with very broad questions because we're working, and then we get narrower and narrower and narrower as we get a better idea from our data, the concepts, categories, and relations that are emerging as a consequence of our investigations. We're not trying to we're looking for causal relationships, but we're not trying to establish them. We're trying to understand the context in which certain phenomenon emerge. So case studies, you'll hear this a lot. This phrase, thick description. This is almost like a trope in terms of discussing qualitative research. You want thick description. You don't want to so what does that mean? Deep data. It's information based on particular context that can give research results a more human face. And so there's a little bit of I would say almost like a creative writing narrative to this. When you do quants, oftentimes you'll write out your model as a mathematical equation, and it's very neat and it's very precise, and also it's got the advantage of being super parsimonious. You can convey a lot of information in one formula. And once you explain what the various, your symbols mean and the relationships and what the maths you're doing are meant to capture in the social world. But with qual, you just got to kind of read a lot. And you have to read a lot in order to get a sense of things. And that means that you have to write a lot or collect a lot of textual data, which we'll get to as being a problem, like a data management problem for qual people. So the point of this is to bridge that gap, get data to fill the gap between abstract research ideas and your concrete practice. That link is made by the data you collect. And you can also maybe compare quantitative results with firsthand observations. I don't know what that is. Like, it's possible. I don't really remember what the context of my notes for why I wrote that. But what are some of the weaknesses? Right? Well, some people would say that there's inherent subjectivity. The case study has long been stereotyped as the weak sibling among social science methods, often criticized as being too subjective, even pseudoscientific. Well, if you're not trying to falsify a new null hypothesis, you don't have to worry about it because you're not making a scientific claim. My argument would be in this case. The investigators, this is according to Yin, quote, the investigators who do case studies are often regarded as having derived from their academic disciplines having deviated from their academic disciplines and their investigations as having insufficient precision, that is, quantification, objectivity, and rigor. The problem with this is that these values are coming from the quant's perspective of universal laws that apply equally to everyone, generalizability, the ability to test a hypothesis. And if you're doing inductive research, that's not the goal. Right? So let me also, I'm going to take a moment here. I might have said this before, but I think it's worth noting. The quants and the social sciences see themselves as, being more informed by the natural sciences. And there's a lot of work that goes into understanding the statistics, the theory, the maths, to understand how to do a latent class analysis or a time series analysis or panel data analysis. It requires a lot of work, right? And there are really interesting things that you can derive from the data collected in a quantitative perspective, right? However, if our goal is to understand social reality, right? That's the whole point of social science. Then when you're a political scientist and you want to understand what is the most important factor in people's vote choice, let's say, you're going to create a model that needs to capture all of the possible theoretical explanations out there in order to put them sort of in competition with each other to see which ones survive the test of your inferential statistical analysis. Bye, Easy 7. Come back in when you're done eating, and guten Appetit. So if I'm going to put together a vote choice model, let's say my vote choice, the party someone votes for is our dependent variable, the thing we want to predict, is equal to some function of a constant plus party identification plus all your sociodemographics, so controlling for age, gender, education, income, where they live in the country, their ethnic background, if they live in an urban or rural area, 7 different things, right? Plus the role of economic evaluation. So I would need prospective and retrospective egocentric economic evaluations, which basically is a fancy way of saying, I predict my finances get better in the next 6 months, and I think my finances have gotten better or worse in the last 6 months. So prospective and retrospective egocentric economic evaluations, prospective and retrospective sociotropic economic evaluations. So do I think that the country's economics in general have gotten better in the last 6 months or worse? And do I think they'll get better or worse in the next 6 months? Oh gosh, there's a whole bunch of other things that you can control for. I forget religion, right? Christian, if they're a fundamentalist, if they're a secularist, a humanist kind of thing. So you get this model, and you're going to have if you have a big enough data set, you can have 14, 15, 16 different variables in it. And for each single variable, you're going to get a result. It might be statistically significant or not, but you will get some kind of coefficient, and you will take the ones that survive the inferential stats test. Let's say it's party identification and economic, egocentric, prospective economic evaluations. And those are the two coefficients that in your whole sample prove to be the best. At predicting how someone would vote. That's what you're trying. Which of these variables really predict, in this case, who's going to vote for what party? You're like, great, I know that party identification and economic evaluations are really important to voters' vote choice in the sample. But that model doesn't apply to a single human being. Like, that model is not meant to represent a real person. That model is a summary of the aggregate of a whole bunch of people. And if you tried to take one individual's personal score, you're not going to get the exact same structure of explanation as you get from throwing everyone together in a big pot and trying to generalize about what all these people, well, what best captures a whole group of people. Qual can do that. Qual can let us get more personal, to hear what people's experiences are, the language they use, the framing of, of how they set things up. So subjectivity, I would argue, is not a weakness of qual, it's the point. We can't get at subjectivity through objective methods. So if we want to understand what people do think and say in their own words, how do people make sense of their world to themselves? You're not going to do that with a one-size-fits-all model. All right, I feel like I'm ranting, so I'm going to stop ranting. I'm going to move on. Okay, next up. You mean YouTube? Oh, I see where I am. Oh, okay. So the other thing too is because you're going to get criticized as a qualitative researcher, or at least you're going to get pulled up on things. There are ways that you can anticipate criticisms and design your research in order to, as best as you can, address those concerns. So if you need, so one of the things that makes research, qualitative research, credible is if you're completely transparent with your methods and your motives. So if you have a case selection and you want to be more credible to your peers or people who review it, you explain why you selected these cases. It's not there's nothing that says this is the wrong case to select. Any case selection could be right depending on your question, but you need to explain why this one. And sometimes it's, I selected this case because of convenience. I selected this case because I'm a PhD student who wants to understand the dynamics of a political party campaign office. And so I can't travel to work at one in a big city. So I'm just using the local party in this recent election as my case selection to do a deep dive into how campaign functions. Convenient samples aren't unreasonable because not all of us have funding. But then, of course, people who understand you selected it because it was a convenient sample, they can bring that knowledge conditionality to your understanding. You can have study implementation or presentation problems, evaluation, all of these things that the question is, where is the subjectivity? Is the subjectivity with the researcher or is the subjectivity with the subjects? Obviously, the subjectivity with the subjects is the problem. That's what we're looking for. What the question here is, are you as a researcher biased? And the way to, I would argue, counter those claims is to just really be transparent with your rationales for everything. Conclusions rely upon personal interpretation of data and inferences. That might be an argument, but honestly, if you're a qual person and you open your data up, that shouldn't be a problem. Results may not be generalizable. Well, who cares? Like, sometimes generalizability isn't the point. If you wanted to, let's say track someone who joined the Tea Party all the way through voting through 2022, you can't generalize that one, but it might be really interesting to see how someone went from the Tea Party into like MAGA terrorism. Difficult to test for validity. That's because validity is the wrong category. Here, in terms of a quant's perspective, we're looking for credibility, I would argue, not validity, but we'll get to those in a bit. Rarely offer a problem-solving prescription. I don't know, that's even true. This is what was listed as possible problems, right? Relying on one or more of a few subjects for cognitive extrapolations might mean one infers too much from what might be from a specific circumstances. So, general rule, be transparent in your case selection, be transparent in like what your motives are, and also don't over-egg the pudding when it comes to your results. Just keep them on what you can see and what you can observe in your data, and then you can speculate as to what exists, but you can't make general claims. Just be careful in your language. Now, another problem, and this is true, because qualitative research relies on this thick description and deep data, you might end up with way more data than you can possibly use. which is frustrating because you end up with like all this rich, good stuff and you have to take a part of it and you've done so much work. So you have to maybe do a bit more over research than a quants person would have to do. Similarly, just by easily controlling, like there's just a series of demographic controls that everyone just bungs in, doesn't really think about anymore. And you just kind of bung those in because the work's already been done. But here, someone's educational background, their history might impact their perspective, and you won't know that unless you ask. Ethical considerations, who's funding it, can conflicts of interest hinder someone's credibility? Again, there's a lot of these things are solvable with just transparency and researcher self-reflection, like autoethnography of your experiences and declaring those in your research. And personal biases, how can influence it. These are, these aren't problems anymore. They're not weaknesses. But they're just things that you should consider. And we talked about ethics before, so I don't want to go over it too much. But we should, it's always, I mean, if you're going to be doing some research and designing a research study, a peer review, not at the end of the research, but whether it's you're going through a process getting ethical approval in your own department or through your supervisor to get, a sign off on doing your research, it's always good to have an outside person kind of check you to help you see things that maybe you're not. And so there's really no problem with ethical compliance in qualitative research. And I know that there's, like I said, there's a whole bunch of stuff here worrying about bias and prejudice. And I think, again, if you have data you've collected where people are speaking for themselves or texts that they've written themselves, and you make that public so other people, anonymize it if you need to, but make it public so other people can go in and independently review it and see if they come to the same conclusions, which is what they do in quants. You put your data set out there, you see if people can replicate your results. Then if you go out and put into an article a whole bunch of conclusions you've drawn from a context setting and you make your data public, someone can come along later and say, I looked at that data and I came to a completely different conclusion. Now, they might have come to a completely different conclusion because they're coming at it from a completely different perspective. And you know what? That's how, the social world works. It's that we don't have an objective rightness or wrongness of voting for Trump. We have people's subjective evaluations of whether or not, Trump is a good leader or he's a threat to democracy. He's a threat to democracy. So one of the things I'm trying to break in myself a lot are these assumed quantitative norms that makes qual the poor relation, and always trying to chase and run up and live up to quants, instead of really embracing the inductive, exploratory, tentative, but groundbreaking information that qualitative research can provide. So basically, just be really super self-reflective on your biases, be open about your perspective, your history. And you can say, as a feminist researcher, I noticed that many of the terms used in the office were very gendered, like chairman and woman, or whatever else. Or perhaps something like, the staff made a real effort to be inclusive of using gender-neutral language, providing gender-neutral bathrooms for people to use, and we're very open and inclusive about pronouns. Whatever it is, So just be, again, if you report it and are open about it, it's the best defense. Okay, let's talk a bit about thick descriptions. Case studies examine the interplay of, let's say, variables here. I'm just going to start using this category, things that I'm using in my articles, concepts, categories, and relations, to provide a complete as possible understanding of an event or a situation derived at through this key term, thick description. So what do we mean? What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for having thick description? I need a coffee sip, so I'm going to mute myself a second. Thick description will provide an in-depth description of the entity being evaluated, or the persons, or the structure, whatever, the circumstances in which it's used, the characteristics of the people involved, the nature of the community, the dynamics, and the possible goals for interpreting the data might be that you're there to document and understand the norms and the values that are underlying a particular group or community or organization. You might be interested in, their values, the dominant attitudes or approaches. Is it a very patriarchal structure or is it a quite egalitarian structure? If people are open about their motives and what they want, you might, like, why do people come and spend time donating, they're volunteering for a political campaign? And you might find that the key thing that comes up and up again is, a group of people who are motivated by a single issue, or it might be people who are retired, who just have more free time. And as a consequence, they've chosen to do this as volunteer work, whatever it is. But this is information that you wouldn't have gotten from doing a survey. It asks why and how questions. Why does this happen? How are these processes functioning? Because it's exploratory and it's inductive, you're looking for relations between things, or you're looking for the way people connect different concepts. It's not looking, qualitative case study research isn't like an experiment in quants, where we try to isolate of everything in the world. We want to isolate just an on-off switch for this variable. We want everything to be the same: the room temperature, the lighting, the computer screen, and the questions and the stimuli. And we want to control our environment. We want to control our participant, and we want to make sure that they all receive the exact same stimuli in the exact same way, so we can get the exact same response, and we don't want any contamination. That's not how the world works. I mean, it's useful and it's insightful. I don't want to trash experimental psychological research or anything, but stuff that happens in the lab is completely artificial, whereas things that happen in the real world that's kind of organically how they emerge. So you're not looking for this isolated single variable that you can say yes or no to. You're trying to understand how things are all connected. And that means that, a holistic understanding does not attempt to break the evidence into parts, but it's looking for the ways that it makes a whole. That's how people experience their social reality holistically. It's interested in inductive outcomes from the specific to the general to eliminate new variables or raise new questions for future research. A huge, huge contribution of qualitative research is that it's perfect for marginalized communities. Most research is done from an assumed heteronormative, cisnormative, patriarchal, quant science perspective. And because that's who does the research. Researchers bring their perspectives with them. And since social science research has been dominated by cis men, dominated by heterosexual men, dominated by people who are caught up in a patriarchy of the academic system, that frames the way that the people they think are worthy of inclusion. There's a lot of invisible communities still that, not invisible, but marginalized communities or communities that have been under-researched, because usually it takes someone from that community to say, I want to know about, just like white guys have been investigating themselves for the last 5,000 years in European and Western tradition. People, if you're not a member of that group, it's harder for you to relate. Anyway, I want to try to wrap this up because I want to get on time and I don't want to drag this out too long. Case studies are often paired up with other methods such as an ethnography or participant observation or a field study. If you're doing an ethnography of you say you're embedded in this political campaign office, you might want to do a case study of student interns, or you might want to do a case study of retirees who come by because they're so different, or there's no research into the link between leisure or freedom in retirement and an increase in political activism, especially among women. We know that women, for instance, are far more likely to run for office when they're older because they tend to have more free time after their childbearing and child-rearing years. And, maybe there's some kind of link there between, women having more free time and seeing more activism after retirement or after the kids grow up. And, you want to go down that topic thread, and there you go. But it will be a subset of your larger analysis of the of the political campaign office. Or perhaps each element of your campaign office study is itself a case study. So you have, like the dynamics of the campaign field office manager in trying to work with very limited resources. And then you have the perspective of the volunteers. And then you might interview the candidate and see if he or she or they are interested or happy with how things are going. So your ethnographic thing might be a series of, case studies of different groups of people who are coming in and out of this location. The idea is to collect data in a natural setting, not in an artificial, experimental, hermetically sealed room that doesn't exist in real life. And you want to look at a holistic interpretation of what's going on, the subject or the topic. Then there's a series of different kinds of case studies. I'm going to run through this pretty quick. Illustrative, these are really focused on descriptive. It's great for you when you have something that has never been that hasn't been explored or has been seriously under-researched. And the point is just to get what exists, what's going on here in the world. So illustrative case studies, or they can be of one-off things, like a one-off situation, a one-off person, that kind of thing. Oh, exploratory or pilot. These are condensed case studies performed before doing a large scale. We talked about the role of pilot studies last week. And a pilot study or an exploratory case study will help you identify questions and select types of measurement before your main investigation. Again, it's the idea that you want to test drive your research before you just go and collect it. And then on the back end, you realize, oh man, I really should have asked this question, or I wish I would have understood that this was in the data back before when I could still change the interview schedule. A cumulative case study approach means you aggregate information from several different sites or several different time points. And this collection of past study data will allow you for greater generalization. This is what we're doing with the qualitative election study of Britain. We have this thing we do where we give people pictures of the main party leaders. And if you're in Scotland, you get the Scottish national leader. And if you're in Wales, you get Plaid Cymru leader. And we ask people to silently brainstorm their words and associations for each party leader, and then mark which ones are positive, negative, or just neutral. And then we've done this in England, Scotland, and Wales, and also during the Scottish referendum. We did it before the election in 2010, basically since 2010. The argument that we're going to be making in this paper is that the concepts that emerged organically from our analysis of what people said about leaders and what was important, there were three categories that emerged in 2010. Competence, trustworthiness, and then generally like a personality category. And this one was the most flexible. It's the one that's kind of like has a nice smile or comes across as a drunk, or like these are much more personal, but they do have a warmth, coldness part of them that showed up enough to warrant their own category. And then when we go to open code in other future, when we've open coded, like because we always start, what does the data say and how are these words connected? What are the concepts or the things that we can say link these disparate sets of words together? The same categories emerged. And every time we've done this, we don't start with, okay, here's personality, trustworthiness, what fits in. We start with all of the words and then kind of like clustering them. Like, so liar, not a liar, trustworthy, seems to be like be trustworthy or believable. And we're kind of like, well, these are all based on trust. I mean, that's a really easy one. Or doesn't seem to know what he's doing on the job. She doesn't seem to have a good grasp of management. I feel very confident whenever she gets up to speak. Whatever it is, that's kind of like a competence thing. So we just find these concepts emerging organically every time we started with open coding. So the argument here is we're picking up on something. These concepts keep emerging, and by comparing over time, we make and over space and over party leaders, the case for the concept generalization becomes stronger and stronger. All right, what do we got? Presuming you have a question which is suitable for a case study method and a theoretical framework for analysis, you want to then work on your study design. What is the logic that links the data that you want to collect and the conclusions that you're going to be trying to draw from your data analysis to the question you're asking. Right? So you have to make all of these so you can say, here's my question, and then I went and collected this data and I drew this conclusion. Like, why this collection method? Why this data analysis? That kind of thing. So you have to have a clear idea. What is the question, or are the questions that you want to study? Write it out in a sentence, write it out in 2 sentences, but keep it pithy. If you can't summarize your research question in like a maximum of 2 sentences, it's too complicated, especially for qual. Especially for qual. What data would be relevant to answer your question? If I'm interested in, how candidates perceive, the inner workings of the state party, well, spending a lot of time in a field office with the campaign manager isn't going to get me the data I need the candidate. So you have to explicitly explain and justify why these data are suitable for answering this question. And that's the same thing in quants. You have to do the same thing in quants. And it's a good thing. You should have to justify, these are the data, and here's why I think it, because other people should know, why you're making that connection. If there are multiple data sources, which data is most appropriate to collect? Because maybe you can't do everything at once, right? So you're going to have to narrow down that question. That question might be what are the ongoing dynamics of the local Democratic Party's campaign office? Way too broad. So you might want to narrow it down to what are the relations between the state party and the county party when it comes to setting up a local field office for the Democratic Party in my area. Right? And so then you can narrow that down from everyone down to much more manageable. And you have to do a lot of advanced planning, how you're going to analyze the data, how you're going to prepare it, because look, I'm going to tell you from so much experience, collecting qualitative data is not that hard. It's work. It's work to design the questions, have a clear idea of what you're looking for, going out and recruiting people, recording their conversations or collecting the data. That's work, but that's not the hard work. The hard work is sifting through the data, taking an audio transcript and turning it into a written transcript, and then reading through it and understanding it so well you know that you can find what you're looking for. You have to know your data well enough and your concepts and your theory and your premise well enough to be able to read through, and code. So having an advanced plan on, am I gonna transcribe the entire interview or only the parts that deal with my question? Plan those things in advance, because otherwise you're going to spend a lot of time on transcribing and coding data you're never going to use, and it's just going to delay your results. According to Yin, the 5 basic components of a case study are the study's questions, its proposed hypotheses, and I'm going to use this very loosely. I'm super sensitive to trying to use quant's language within a qual framework, because it also transfers the values of quants into the qual framework inappropriately. So I'm not going to say the studies I should, these are quite old. I would change some of the language, but these I'm also quoting from Yin. So I don't want to change his or her language, their language unilaterally. But anyway, I would say your proposed speculation or predictions, right? Hypothesis means to me a null hypothesis. What are your units of analysis? What's the logic? A causal logic or relational logic linking the data to your prediction, your speculation. And then what are your criteria? Be very clear. What are the criteria for interpreting your findings? Is it based on the number of times a word is mentioned, or is it based on the time a concept comes up despite the wording used, or how it comes up? In terms of the data that you can collect, you can talk to individuals through interviews. You can just do a participant observation and observe them directly. You can get ethnographic and get right in there, maybe even volunteer to experience what it's like to work on a campaign and go do door-to-door stuff or do lit, whatever it is, right? So you can watch people, you can observe yourself, you can participate yourself, you can talk to people, you can read their text, artifacts, personal, official documents, archival records. In a campaign setting, it might be campaign lit that comes out, or various maps where how they targeted different neighborhoods for lit drops, whatever it is. Okay? So it's pretty broad. A case study will be more convincing and accurate if it's based on several different sources of information, unless, unless you're like doing an interview of 3 CEOs in order to get their perspectives, and it's meant to be very specific to them. If you want to do something that is potentially more generalizable, then you need more data sources. Cross-checking the data from multiple sources can provide this multi-dimensional approach. And Miriam writes that checking, verifying, testing, probing, and confirming collected data as you go, this process will follow in a funnel-like design, resulting in less data gathering in the later phases of the study, along with a congruent increase in analysis, checking, verifying, and confirming. If you start with a very open question and you want to get down to a point where, you're honing in, you're starting to get that sense of theoretical saturation, the lines of the concept are becoming more and more clear. That means you can be more focused in your approach. The problem here too, though, I would just say is, you don't want to get too much tunnel vision, but there is something to be said about the fact that as you go on in your data collection, you will get a confidence in, sorry, I gotta get distracted by something. You'll get a confidence in understanding when your concept is being discussed, and is it new information or is it stuff you've heard before? Because you've probably heard it 20 or 40 times already. All right, so getting back to... Yin goes on to stress the importance of clearly articulating your theoretical perspective, determining the goals of what years you're trying to illuminate, the selection of your subjects, the method of your data collection, and what is the final report that you're going to do? I mean, if you're doing a 5-page report, the data you need to collect is going to be way less comprehensive and way less in scope than if you're writing a thesis. So that's another thing you need to make sure that the data is suitable to fit the remit of the final product. You don't want to over-collect or under-collect. Chances are you're going to over-collect, but... You can use case studies with other methods. As I say, you can triangulate. It's a good way to get an insight into a larger project. Think in advance what material could be considered data in relation to your question, and be open later on to other sources of data that might emerge, like getting copies of the transcripts of radio ads for the candidates running or whatever. So your goal is to obtain a clear picture of the participants as possible. Holy kid, that was really... The goal is to obtain as clear a picture of the participants as possible. That's a lot of syllables. You can do that through interviews, participant observation, analyzing text or their talk, and content analysis. If the focus is on one individual, are you looking at one person, a group of person? If it's a group, it should be small because you're not going for representativeness, although you definitely want enough of a sample of different kinds of people in the group to get a lot of different perspectives. And you want to do a brief case history of your study's participants to provide yourself and the reader with a clearer understanding of their perspectives, their history, their goals, and how their personal experiences might affect the outcome of their study. I recall going to a presentation in Essex from a PhD student who was interested in analyzing American attitudes toward the Second Amendment. And she did an ethnographic piece of research where she went in and she lived with NRA proponents. She lived with people who really, really were into their Second Amendment rights. And then she wrote up her, she took all their perspectives and she wrote up her own. And after they read it, some people got in contact with her and felt like they'd been betrayed because they thought they'd kind of convinced her because she was very receptive, she was interested in getting them to talk. So when you do that, you signal agreement as encouragement, but people can take agreement like, yeah, I want to hear more of that. Yeah, okay, I understand what you're saying, as I'm convincing you. So I just thought it was kind of a real world experience of the consequences of doing these kinds of embedded qualitative real world things is that, you are trying to get information to make sure that you're clear with your research. But yeah, a lot of people, just think ethically about how some people might feel about that. All right. So, moving on. Hold on I have to do something really quick here. Apologies. Let me also, how are things going in the chat? Y'all doing okay? Everything good? I hope this isn't, we're going to be wrapping up and then I can tell you a bit more about what we're going to be doing next week. So, yep, that all looks okay. Okay. I think we're pretty close to the end here. We're on slide 25. I think a lot of the stuff I'm kind of covered. So 7 analytical frameworks. This is important. These are different ways that you can think about your qualitative research before you start your data collection, not after. So ways that you can think about framing the way that you even approach the whole topic is, it might be focused on people, and that's a very common one, but you might want to be focusing on communication exchanges. Or maybe you want to look at the organization in terms of its history, or a thematic. Cool, everyone. Thank you for the positive feedback that you're there. Thematic framework or resources evaluation. You might want to look at rituals and symbols that people engage in. Like this is more like, let's say, I know that someone did a study of rituals and symbolism in terms of the use of the monarchy and symbols of the monarchy in British governmental procedures. Like the fact that they have the Queen's crown there, or they've got the staff, or they've got to like walk it in, all that kind of stuff. Like what does engaging in these practices mean for the legitimacy of the decisions made? Or you might want to look at critical incidents that challenge or reinforce fundamental beliefs and practices. A crisis in the church, and when they're, a crisis in the Catholic Church, when it's uncovered that they deal with a lot of sexual predators. They hide a lot of sexual predators, and how do they deal with that? You're not going to generalize from that. That's just going to be a case study on a particular thing that hopefully will never happen again, right? But you want to document that in real time, and that's a good place to use a case study. You can also look for patterns among the data, meaning in concepts or in values or in processes. So it's very open-ended. And if you go to a qualitative research project not having a clear idea of what you're looking for, you're only going to get more lost. It's not saying that you have to only look for the thing you're looking for. You might find something else along the way. It's like, but if you're going to go out if you're going to go out to a national park, you're going to want to find a path. You're going to want to start with a plan, right? You're going to have a map and a plan, and maybe bring some water. And maybe in the course of going on your walk, you find a path less traveled, and you decide to veer off the main path, and instead take this side path that looks a little more interesting to you. That's fine. But don't just show up at the national park and start walking in the woods, like without a map, without direction. And that would be like the analogy of doing qualitative research without a really precise idea of the concept and the relations that you're looking for. You might find that new factors emerge, right? I mean, I've kind of covered this already, that you can either deviate from your original question to explore this new thing that might be completely original, or you can point to it in the future as to why you should get more funding to do it later. And now, reporting. Oh, all the stuff with data qual is so much fun until you get to this part. And then this is the real work. The challenge is that you've got so much data. You will have too much data. You'll have more data than you need, which is a problem you want to have. Because in qual, you would rather have an abundance of riches when it comes to data. You would rather have, 25 really convincing illustrations of a point from your conversations with people when you only need 5 than to need 5 and only have 5, But the problem then is you have to know your data in a deep way. And the only way you're going to know that is by reading, which takes a lot of time. So data is extensive description, and you have to balance description and analysis. So the way that, and again, this is about transparency and being self-reflective with yourself as a researcher. And quants people don't always do this because they think they're just reporting. They go, oh, here are my numbers. Here's my test. Here's my results. But interpretation always requires some subjectivity. The construction of a narrative to explain a causal relationship requires us to intervene and fill in the gaps and provide context. And when we choose which context to include and exclude and what order to tell our story in, all of this is a subjective creation. I'm not saying it's all subjective. I'm saying that the way we report our results are subjective. just like the newspapers can't be. If a newspaper was completely objective, it would just be a series of facts with no other information, just floating around loose. As soon as you decide, someone decides, I'm going to put this point first and then this point. I'm going to quote this person first and then that person. I'm going to present these results, but not those results. You're injecting some subjectivity. So a case study like this parallel in quants or news reporting is a story. You're going to put together a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end, with a question, some data, and a conclusion. And you're going to have characters, exposition, maybe even dialogue, maybe pictures, maybe links to videos of the real people involved. But all of that is, going to be hanging together on this main research question you have. That's going to be the main thread of your research question. And hopefully, you're in a position where you can publish your data so that other people can go back and look at it. But by necessity, you have to pare down. Your starting structure could be to address each step of your research process, set up the reader with as much context as needed, the decisions you made regarding your research design, and the conclusions you've drawn. And there is a hesitancy in academia and the quant side there is, the tendency to write in this authorial, or this author's voice, you remove the I, me, and mine. You might say we when you refer to your co-author, or if you're doing a review, you say we to kind of like cover up the fact of how many authors there are. You don't mention your subjectivity. You don't mention anything like that because the goal is to have this kind of disembodied knowledge that's being disseminated, which is kind of silly, but it is the case. So in qual, the idea here is to be a person, and talk about, like I did this, I did that. And it's not saying doesn't have to be every sentence has to be I, but you're not actively trying to suppress your existence as a human being while you're reporting on your research. So I think that looks like the end. Oh, shoot. Okay. You can see here that I'm trying to use the principle I learned from How to Avoid Death by PowerPoint, and using black backgrounds with white text instead of white backgrounds with black text because it's so much nicer on the eyes. And I have to agree, but I missed out too. Okay, data reporting. You need a detailed explanation of your theoretical positions, or in this case, of the concepts that are underpinning your theoretical speculations in terms of establishing those linkages for possible causal relations that can be tested later deductively. You have to report how your theories drove the inquiry. Here's this theory. I don't like theories here. Speculation or questions. What drove the investigation to produce the primary research? Maybe, again, if you're coming from a feminist perspective, you want to look to see whether or not a whole bunch of campaign offices gender their roles, or whether or not, parties on the left are more egalitarian in the roles that they dole out. So everyone can bring snacks and everyone can go out and put together yard signs. And maybe in the more fundamentalist conservative, it's the ladies who bring in the snacks and take care of that. And it's the guys who go out and bang together the yard signs on the wooden sticks and go put them out with, hammers in people's yards because that's physical labor. Maybe that's maybe that's what you want to investigate. You want to, depending on the amount of anonymity that you've pledged, describe the participants' backgrounds, and you can give a generic enough review to give a sense. Someone is retired, lives in a middle-class neighborhood. Another person is a college student who has a passion for whatever. But it gives a little bit of flavor and understanding and framework for the reader as to the kinds of people you are interacting with. You want to be transparent in your data collection process. And if you are using a textual form of content analysis, maybe you've been using a software like NVivo, or you've been using Excel spreadsheets to help you code keywords, then you want to explain the training that you've given in terms of doing a more quantsy coding of like when a positive negative comes up in discussions. And, there's a more quantsy approach to doing content analysis that involves a double blind coding process based on predetermined concepts indecision criteria as to how to rule on cases. And then you can test it out by having two independent people code using the same data and the same instructions, and then do a correlation analysis to see to what extent they code identically the same things based on the it's a whole quants thing. It's a whole quants thing that we're not going to talk about right now. It's important if you're doing quants. It's hugely important to have double-blind coding when you do the quants side of. But we're not going to talk about that. Okay. And then the other thing too, make obvious the connections between the data and your conclusions. Start your paper with your conclusions. The best piece of advice on writing academically, one of the best pieces of advice, I got a lot of them, was from my supervisor, which is your thesis isn't a mystery novel, and we're not going to be turning the page waiting to find out who done it at the end. The whole point is you lay out your premise at the beginning, you declare your position, your findings, and then the rest of your paper is explaining how you got there. So it is quite, I think, important to clearly state at the outset what it is people are getting into when they start reading your document. And that's where we are in my replication paper with my co-author right now, is because we're switching the emphasis away from a more quantsy focus on process replication into analytical generalization of concepts. We kind of have to go back and change the whole, in this paper, we argue that, and move it from replication to analytic generalization. And at the end, you want to show links to future studies, like other things that came up that could be researched by someone else, things that came up that could be expanded on in the future. All right, and then that is the last slide. That is absolutely the last slide. So I think this is where I look at y'all to see if you have any questions. And hold on, I'm going to move so my eye, oh, there we go. I think it doesn't really matter. I'll just look at you. I'll put this behind so I'm looking at you. You need to type louder. Okay, never mind. Speculation, I have a bad taste in men. Proof, look at the men that I think are hot. Okay, so it looks to be that there aren't too many questions. And you all seem to be just sort of absorbing it. It got a little repetitive at the end, but I think that's because I anticipated a lot of the things that I was going to say at the end of my talk early on, because I've given this lecture a few times. Yeah, that's it for today. I think we are good to go. I think it is the end of this show. Next week, all right, I don't have my academia.edu page up. It will be a mystery. I will tell you what the topic will be next week when it gets closer in time, but it will be something related to qualitative research. I can promise you that. Again, if you are enjoying the sound of my voice, you can go listen to me and Dana Cole talk about the language of patriarchy, which is on the channel now. And if you want to hear more of my voice and my friends, fun times, good. You can watch the Rolling Left channel over on Twitch, where we are going to continue on with our silly Waterdeep, well now Undermountain adventure with my players. So until next week, thanks y'all for stopping by. I do very much appreciate it. Thank you for your time and attention. I've been Kristi. You've been awesome. Be safe, be happy, be well, wherever it is and whenever it is you are.